We continue our discussion of new wave groups with our discussion of British bands now, having in the last video talked about the American groups. The British new wave groups are the ones that really sort of had success in this country when what we thought of with punk music was really sort of rising. Punk really didn't, as I said before, punk really didn't happen in this country in the same way that it did in the UK, at least not in a commercial way. It certainly happened in subcultures, but by the time these guys are having records on the radio and having charts, it really is a sort of new wave music. And Elvis Costello, though he came out of the punk scene in the UK, really is thought of as one of the first British artists here doing new wave. That is this sort of more, the safer version of punk. Most rock fans, maybe the first exposure they had to punk/new wave was in December of 1977 when Elvis Costello and his band appeared on Saturday Night Live. Back in those days, Saturday Night Live was the show that you wanted to get on if you wanted to sort of reach young America. It was a very edgy comedy show. It was on after 11:30 on Saturday nights, and so they could get away with things you couldn't get away with in prime time. So you really wanted to be on Saturday Night Live. And the Sex Pistols were supposed to be on there, but for some reason they couldn't get there. There was a visa trouble or border trouble. I'm not quite sure what it was, but they couldn't be there. So Elvis Costello substituted for them. And so he was supposed to do a song called Less Than Zero, and that's the one they had blocked with the camera people during rehearsal. But he got on stage, live television now, and started Less Than Zero and told the band, stop, there's no reason to do that song here. And they launched into the song Radio, Radio, which had not even been released in this country yet. Lorne Michaels, the guy who produced the show, Saturday Night Live, was furious. And he said to Elvis Costello in words that, he said, "You'll never work in this town again." Of course, it didn't really work out that way for Elvis Costello, now did it? Lorne Michaels had no idea the kind of career that Elvis Costello would ultimately have. But that incident and that appearance on that show was what a lot of the first rock fans saw as punk and new wave coming out of the UK. After that follows a lot of these American groups that I was talking about before, Blondie and Cars and Talking Heads, and the hits that they had sort of follows on this Elvis Costello kind of breaking the ice in this way. His album from 1977, My Aim Is True, had already gone to number 32 in this country, the big song on that, Allison. But it was This Year's Model, now done with Elvis Costello and the Attractions from 1978, that really started to put him on radio. So you might hear some Elvis Costello, you might hear some Cars, you might hear some Talking Heads now on FM rock radio. The two big tunes there, Pump It Up, and of course Radio, Radio, getting plenty of airplay. Those first three Elvis Costello records, very influential in establishing new wave. The other British band there are a couple of other groups that are worth noting. I happen to be a particularly big fan of Joe Jackson, who had a great album come out at about this time. But let's talk a minute about the Police, a group that would end up being maybe in some ways the most important and influential group of the late 70s and the early 80s. It's interesting about the Police that if you would have asked somebody in 1984 or 1985, who's the band that will be remembered in rock history as being more important, the Police or U2? Of course, U2 was a younger band at an earlier stage of their career at the time. Most people said, well, undoubtedly the Police. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. U2 has ended up being a fantastic, one of the sort of mega superstar bands of the history of rock music. But it just goes to show how big the Police were, and important the Police were perceived to be in their day, led by Sting on bass and vocals, Stuart Copeland on drums, and Andy Summers on guitars, a blend of Sting's sort of intelligent and very sort of, his lyrics filled with literary references, his sort of high, at first sort of reggae influenced kind of voice, Stuart Copeland's kind of tricky and sort of jazz influenced kind of drumming, and Andy Summers' atmospheric sort of guitarscapes that he creates really create a kind of a Police sound that really has a trademark sound to it. There was a big reggae influence early in the group's music. I can remember the first time I heard Roxanne, and I thought it was some sort of a reggae tune of Bob Marley at first, you know, what's going on here. The album that's on, Outlandos d'Amour, 1979, number 23 in this country. Roxanne went to number 32. The other album on that, the other song on that, Can't Stand Losing You, going to number 42. The sound of the Police, I think, gets, as their records unfold, going toward things like Synchronicity in the 1980s, maybe a little less reggae influenced and a little bit, they sort of more find their own voice. But at the beginning, it was easy to hear that kind of reggae thing and a very sort of sparse texture. I mean, Andy Summers does a lot to fill the sound out on the guitar using chorusing and various kinds of things like that, but still it's a pretty sparse texture compared to the prog rock that we talked about earlier in this week's lectures and a couple of weeks ago. So let's talk a little bit now about New Wave and some of the things that I was talking about in the last video with regard to irony. New Wave is one of the first styles that we can think of in popular music that really makes strong references to rock's own past. It's now like at the end of the 70s, we're now starting to get to a point where rock music has got enough of its own history that we can start to refer to it. So in order to really get it, in order to get the irony of New Wave, you have to know the repertoire they're referring to. You can't really hear late 1970s New Wave and get what they were trying to do with the irony there if you don't know the 60s music or the late 50s music that it's referring to, right? Somebody like Elvis Costello comes out with the horn-rimmed glasses. If you don't know that those horn-rimmed glasses are screaming Buddy Holly, you're kind of missing it. It just seems like a fashion choice, when in fact it's a kind of an ironic use, it's a kind of ironic collage. Now, are these ironic references meant to kind of embrace the past? This hippie rock music is not very good. Let's go back to this early music that was way better. Well, in the case of people like Tom Petty, that's actually what he's thinking, but he's in the minority. Most of them are just using early 60s music, late 50s rock music, because it's a way of creating a critique on the present. It's like going to the past to escape from the present, or going to the past to express how much you don't like what's going on in the present. It's a kind of an ironic use. It's a way of distancing yourself. You're not really making an aesthetic statement. You're just making a criticism. You're adding a kind of a layer of observation to what's happening in the musical culture. I think that's really what lies at the heart of at least late 1970s New Wave music. Other historians will maybe differ with me on this, but that's really what I take away from it. Having come up during those days and having been a teenager as that music was coming out, it was very hard for us not to recognize what this music was referring to, and to recognize that what it was referring to was markedly not hippie music. It was all sort of pre-Sgt. Pepper. It was a little bit like taking hippie music and sort of rubbing its nose in its past or something like that. It was an act of rebellion, but an act of aesthetic rebellion, not really political rebellion. It was a kind of a lifestyle choice in a lot of kinds of ways. So what I would say is, in terms of the historical stuff that happens in the uses of the past, it all comes from earlier music as a way of creating a critique on the present. And in that way, punk rock, and more importantly, New Wave music, constitutes a rejection of the hippie aesthetic. And all of a sudden, now New Wave bands and disco are in the same kind of boat as coming in at the middle to end of the 1970s and rejecting the music that had dominated rock music up to that point. Now, let's take a few minutes in the next video to basically summarize what it is that we've been talking about in the 70s. So in the next video, I'll try to pull together what we've done in the first 3 weeks of this course to kind of draw a big picture of the 70s in rock music.